China is a country of 1.4 billion people. Out of that enormous population, 143 million individuals from China consider themselves to be die-hard basketball fans, while a little less than half of the country see themselves as simply casuals. The reason of basketball's explosion in popularity is this guy right here, David Stern, NBA's most famous commissioner, a commissioner that managed to lift NBA from its darkest period and one of the first people to recognize China's huge potential. In 1987, the NBA went to China and struck a deal with Chinese state television provider CCTV. The deal was that the NBA would send videotapes with game footage for CCTV to broadcast, and they would divide the advertising revenue from these broadcasts, which was negligible at that time, a quite different method of watching games compared to what we are used to nowadays. So anyways, these NBA highlight tapes were sent weekly from New York and began to make basketball free to watch across much of China. Thus, every child in China, like Yao Ming, grew up watching and idolizing current time superstars while secretly dreaming of one day actually playing in the NBA themselves. And when Yao went to the States in the early 2000s, Yao Ming was not only an economic success for the league, but also Yao Ming became an icon for the Asian population all across the planet. For the first time, millions of Asians and Asian Americans saw a face that looked like them on the big television screen. Yao Ming wasn't just shown as a basketball athlete, he was also represented in hundreds of campaigns and commercials and gave the young Asian generation a role model to follow. Even before Yao Ming, China traditionally was a basketball powerhouse in Asia. It was mainly because other rich Asian countries like Japan didn't care that much about basketball, and Western Asian countries such as Jordan, Qatar, Lebanon, and especially Iran didn't have the financial needs nor the political will to improve their basketball programs. And only Philippines, who historically always were crazy for basketball, and South Korea posed a real threat to China, but China won 14 out of 16 FIBA Asian Cups between 1975 and 2005. What doesn't get talked about much, that yes, it was mainly Yao Ming carrying China in the 2000s era, but China had some pretty nice players outside of Yao, specifically at the center position that played in the NBA. Wang Zhizhi, Menke Batir, and a young prospect Yi Zhenliang. Obviously, China never won anything special on the world stage, but once in a while they managed to be competitive against the European countries, occasionally even winning against them. And when Yao Ming, after suffering excruciating injuries throughout multiple seasons, decided to retire, there were concerns whether China could replace their gentle giant. But I don't generally think that even the Chinese basketball fans expected how fucking badly will things twist in their basketball system. So first of all, let's tackle the question, how the hell China doesn't have any athletes in the NBA currently? To make things even worse, the last two players that were drafted in the NBA from China was Zhou Qi and Wang Zhilin 8 years ago. I will repeat myself, 8 straight draft combines filled with prospects all around the globe: France, Serbia, African continent countries. China didn't have no second rounders, no players heading to the G League in hopes to make the league. 8 straight years and no talent from China even came close to being near the NBA. And there's a really good reason for that. Remember when I mentioned that China had pretty nice players at the center position that played in the NBA, and China never really had problems with tall people or tall athletes. So excluding obviously Yao Ming and even maybe Yi Zhenliang, Chinese centers were always limited, meaning they maybe provided somewhat of a decent rim protection, but that's pretty much it. In general, the old school NBA was filled with 7-footers that didn't really have any skill outside of their obvious height, but always seemed to find a spot on any given team. But in the modern era, NBA began transforming. Organizations like San Antonio Spurs and Golden State Warriors implemented lineups where all 5 players, including the center position, could pass the ball. And the Dubs pushed the limit even further, emphasizing three-point line and spacing. Also, numbers and efficiency became a huge factor, and then the unicorns happened. Centers like Kristaps Porzingis, Nikola Jokic, big guys that had the length but at the same time could shoot the ball, pass the ball, simply put were extremely skilled, were taking over the league. Overall, if you look at the NBA right now, it has the most talented and skilled players ever. And China fumbled in adapting and developing their young players. NBA doesn't care anymore if you're just a 7-footer. Teams want to see skilled big guys or to have big guys that can protect their rim, use their length to alter shots, to switch on perimeter against smaller guards. The days when just being tall gives you a spot on the roster are kinda over. And I think a great example of a typical player from China, which also gives you an insight of the level of competition in the Chinese Basketball Association, which, believe me, we will talk about it later in the video, it's this guy right here, Wang Zhilin. As I mentioned before, Wang was drafted in 2016. This is his highlights against the USA's men's national team in an exhibition game, and I mean, the dude looked decent, good size, strong body, obviously needed to do a shitload of work, but he was 22 at that time. But here's the problem. Jaylen Wang never left China. Due to the limited talent pool of local players, the teams drastically overpay for Chinese athletes. And why on earth would a local player go to the G League or Europe for way less money? For example, Cho Chi, when he was 18 years old, signed a $700K 3-year deal, and God knows how much do the Chinese players make from advertisement deals. It creates a greenhouse effect, where local players have zero initiatives to go out of their comfort zone and develop in a tougher competition. Why would they if they are getting paid good money in China? So Wang Jaylen is dominating CBA. I mean, he had 60-point game, clearly the competition is too easy for him. But when the 2023 FIBA World Cup tournament began, and I remember this vividly because I was watching all Asian countries in the World Cup, Wang looked horrible. Evidently, the international competition was too fast and too physical for Wang, and we're talking about a player that in that same year averaged 22 points and 12 rebounds per game and became CBA's MVP. Like, that's crazy. And Jaylen is a perfect embodiment of China's basketball league's level. Their whole national team was based with local players. Even Zhou Qi after the World Cup tournament went back to China. Before that he played in Australia. But China lost to tiny Puerto Rico, South Sudan, who by the way established their independence in 2011, and they failed to win against their rival Philippines. I mean, they got smashed by Philippines, and their games are always competitive as each country wants to win badly against each other, but this struggle on international level became a norm for China, even in the Asian Cup. Last medal came 11 years ago. In 2017 they lost against Australia, who by the way, just like China, played athletes only from their local Australian league. And in the most recent Asian Cup, China lost to tiny Lebanon. And of course, national team's performance is a direct indication of China's basketball situation in their main league. But firstly, I want to explain how difficult it is to develop athletes, specifically when we talk about team sports. China has been pretty good in winning Olympic medals. Some sports are straight up dominated by players from China, like table tennis. Chinese players have won the men's world championship 60% of the time since 1959. Now, I'm not shitting on table tennis saying that it's an easy sport to prepare athletes for, but for the most Olympic sports you have the sense that a lot of them are basically mechanics and grinding your way to the perfection of those mechanics. And while basketball requires you to grind on a lot of different mechanics. We're talking things like not only shooting the ball but being able to shoot in motion, in rhythm, catch and shoot, off dribble, training your muscle memory to be able to shoot the ball with the same correct mechanic. Things like handling the ball with both of your hands, also not basketball related aspects like creativity, awareness, improvisation that most of players from China drastically lack. Because whenever I watch Chinese players play, everything is textbook. You should do things this way, not the other way. Let's even take a basketball player like Tyrese Haliburton. You know that basketball textbook rule that you shouldn't jump and then look for a pass? Well, NBA All-Star breaks that rule on a regular basis. Basketball demands some kind of unorthodox approach. You need to develop different skill sets both on offense and defense, and especially nowadays top leagues want to see big guys having skills of a point guard. Even Luka Doncic plays like a center sometimes. Basketball doesn't have a clear approach. You can't put players into a box and teach them to play in one way. To top that, you need to develop players to play as a team, fulfilling different roles, and differently from most Olympic sports, including table tennis, you're training 12 equally talented players that need to connect with each other, not 1, not 3, but 12. And that alone requires more resources, so in my opinion, it's way easier to develop a tennis table player than a basketball athlete. Also, China is relatively new to basketball. The Americans have what, 3 generations of basketball players, and the NBA is filled with athletes who dads were either playing in the NBA or Europe or somehow were involved with basketball in the past. And a majority of those ex-players with a massive experience are coaching kids, teenagers, older players, trying to pass that knowledge. And this is one of the main reasons why China doesn't have any NBA level talents. The basketball culture is simply not there. They don't know the essentials how to raise an NBA level athlete. It also doesn't help that with all the money invested in their main basketball league, the level of the competition is still shit. I'm saying this as politely as possible. When we discuss Asian basketball leagues, South Korea, in my opinion, is a hidden gem. You legitimately can learn new things from watching South Koreans play ball. Meanwhile, Japan sorted their shit out when FIBA went in to fix the mess that Japanese basketball was in. The league was established in 2016, they have a TV deal with Amazon Prime, occasionally they stream their games on YouTube to an international audience with English commentary. Some teams like Tokyo Alvark are owned by big companies. Every single year the league are raising more and more finances, and differently from China, just throwing millions into basketball, Japan are looking to steadily grow their league with truly impressive projects. And when we talk about basketball product in general, South Korea and Japan are pretty decent. Meanwhile, whenever I watch CBA's games, it's like I gain nothing. It's like watching shitty movie for gigs. They sign these ex-NBA, ex-EuroLeague players, they go there, dominate the game, scoring 50, 70 points. How the hell a 40-year-old Hamed Haddadi is scoring 27 points with 18 boards in a basketball game? Like, this alone explains the level of Chinese league. The reason why it's interesting to watch basketball in Japan and South Korea, they kinda put their own flavor to the way they support, broadcast, and play basketball. Meanwhile, China is cooped up in the idea that in order to be successful, you need to copy NBA. There's so much ISO ball, but differently from NBA, there's zero rim protection. Players are driving with a straight line towards the rim. Their big guys are extremely big with good wingspans, but that's pretty much it. Whenever I watch CBA's games, I always had this feeling that the American players could just score points whenever they wanted to. Even some Chinese more talented players could just straight up get buckets. Players in China are not equipped to play any kind of defense. On team defense, they constantly get lost. On individual defense, they're constantly slow. They can't defend without fouling, thus the referees are forced to swallow their whistles. But I can't really express how much players from China don't know how to defend without fouling. They always seem to get all kinds of issues in international stage because of different officiating. Also, China and Philippines, including Taiwan, are the only leagues that I'm aware of that play with FIBA's rules, but with 12-minute periods, which again is a strange mixture of both NBA and FIBA, as the 12-minute periods changes the amount of possessions and value of a single possession. So they play 12-minute periods in their own country, then they need to play internationally, they switch up to 10-minute periods. Which I don't think that it benefits anyone. Sure, the idea of aligning yourself to NBA is your local audience, you kinda want CBA to be like NBA for the ratings, but it's kinda clear that it doesn't benefit the development of the players. Being stuck in this limbo where you're not even sure what your basketball identity is, it doesn't give your athletes the best chances to succeed. The only time we hear about CBA is when ex-NBA players have an explosion offensively and scores like 50 points. The other times we hear about the league is when those same ex-NBA players are involved in fights. Fights and scuffles aside, the biggest scandal that even made Yao Ming to resign from his CBA chairman duties happened last year in the playoffs. Best of 3 playoff series, Shanghai Sharks, a team that is constantly being memed on Reddit and Twitter pages, going against Jiangsu Dragons. What the fans in the whole league didn't know was that Shanghai Sharks and Jiangsu Dragons struck a deal to lose and win certain games. And the reason for this deal was this guy over here, simply because he received a 4-game suspension before the playoffs, so the Sharks figured, why not extend the series as long as possible, thus playing through that suspension, and to have their leader Eric Bledsoe back in the upcoming playoffs leg. Pretty fucking genius. And well, the only issue that this was straight up match fixing. They lost on purpose the second game, and on the third game, Jiangsu Dragons began throwing their lead in the most obvious way. Dragons had a 4-point lead, more than 1 minute left to play in the game, and suddenly, out of nowhere, Dragons players forgot how to dribble the ball, how to pass the ball, or play defense. And like, the only thing that I was wondering, were they that stupid or so comfortable knowing that no one will notice what's exactly happening? And yes, the coaches were in on it, the GMs, the players, everyone on both teams were involved in it besides Eric Bledsoe, who didn't play. The whole last minute sequence resulted in Dragons turning the ball over and over again. They couldn't inbound the ball correctly, it's like suddenly all their basketball talents got sucked out. You have members from your national basketball team being involved in match fixing. The coaches, including general managers, were suspended from the league for up to 5 years, each team received a fine. And Shanghai Sharks of course initiated this match fixing as they benefited the most from the extended series, which is sad because it's one of the historic Chinese teams. Yao Ming even started his basketball career in Sharks. And this incident alone embodies China's basketball. They throw shitload of money to sign big players, but it doesn't fix your problems and it doesn't lift your basketball level. What instead you could do is take the money that you give to Jimmer Fredette, call up Spanish, Australian or Serbian teams and offer them to accept your local players. It works for Japanese players in European football as the federation covers a certain amount of their wages, and if they don't succeed and come back to China, it's still gaining a valuable experience. But there's a certain amount of pride in China. I think Chinese generally think that the best option for their young athletes is to develop in their motherland, so sending players to Australia or USA for development is an afterthought. It's really similar to how Filipinos were gatekeeping Kai Sotto. There was a drama with their federation, of course money was involved as they wanted to keep Kai Sotto in Philippines. He left for USA, then he came back again to Philippines, and thus it stunted his growth and no NBA team wanted to draft Kai. Also, we need to mention the fact that Chinese Basketball Federation is highly influenced by the Communist Party, like everything in China. So out of the box thinking and applying new methods in basketball, I wouldn't say that it's deeply appreciated. The federation most likely are filled with people that never seen the insides of an NBA organization. So they desperately clinch on doing things the old school way, because that's the only way they know, and that's happening everywhere in everything, not only basketball.